Well met. This is the third part of my 4-part video essay series on what I think to be issues in contemporary Warcraft lore. If you want the full introduction, you can go watch the introduction section in episode 1. Link in the description. The main thing to note is that you will occasionally see numbers in brackets in the corner of the video, like so. These are citation numbers for when I make claims that I feel should be backed up with a source. You can find the citation in question in the description by the corresponding number. If you'd prefer to read instead of watch, I will also be putting these episodes in text format on my website. Link also in the description. This episode concerns the recent use of unreliable narrators in Warcraft lore, and why I think they are a poor fit in their current scale and use for Warcraft. So, in the immortal words of one Benjamin Brode,
so as the archaeologists say, let's dig in.
Things being intentionally mysterious is not a new development for Warcraft, of course. Cryptic old gods have been a thing since Warcraft 3. For many years, it was known that something evil lay under Tirisfal Glades, but not what. Volume 1 of the Chronicle leaves explicitly ambiguous what caused Aman'Thul, first of the Titans, to awaken, or what the origin of the Emerald Dream is, for example. And it continues to be a mystery what exactly lies behind those 2 gates in Blackrock Depths, and so on and so on. And similarly, Warcraft's always had some elements of unreliable and fallible narration. The whispers from Yogg-Saron, people from the Horde and Alliance trash-talking the other faction, Grand Magistrix Elisande saying that she has determined that the Legion's victory is inevitable, or Scourge propaganda, or Archbishop Benedictus's fallen rantings, or that strange memory of Arthas giving somewhat pessimistic predictions for the future, or King Yimiron blaming the Titans for the curse of flesh and justifying his atrocities, or just people giving their subjective view on someone's character, and so on and so on. I say all this to make it clear that in this video I am not arguing that unreliable and fallible narration is wholly out of place in Warcraft. And what is more, I am fully in support and approval of its continued presence. What I am arguing is that the, as said at the start, current scale and use of such narrative devices, so to say, is unfit for the Warcraft universe. A brief note before going forward. From here on out, for the sake of ease and brevity, I will be using the term unreliable narrator to refer both to deceitful narrators, like for example Onyxia in her guise of Lady Katrana Presto, and to fallible narrators, that is, people giving the best information they have, but who could be off the mark, like for example Firim. By the scale of unreliable narration in modern Warcraft, I mean that whereas in the past it has been seen in individual characters and situations, it has now extended to practically every source of lore. By its use in modern Warcraft, I mean that whereas in the past it has served as a way of expressing character and introducing some elements of mystery, it is now used to cast doubt on practically any background information. Now, those are very harsh judgments on my part, but unfortunately, I think they are warranted. Even putting aside the actual practice of it, which we'll get to in a few moments, members of the narrative team have even explicitly stated the widespread use of unreliable narrator. For example, former principal narrative designer Steve Denuser mentioned in an interview in the April of 2020 that one of the narrative goals of the then upcoming Shadowlands expansion was specifically to inspire re-examination of previously known lore. Indeed, The most recent example of such statements is also the most explicit. In an interview with the website Millennium in the October of 2023, lead narrative designer Anne Stickney and assistant lead quest designer Catherine Bankson stated that, for the narrative team, at present, upon seeing a narrative error or inconsistency, invoking Unreliable Narrator is one of their first resorts. So, unfortunately, I don't think, even putting aside the actual specific instances of such unreliable narrating, that its newfound prominence is deniable. But one ought to go to specifics also. Starting with the scale, as I put it. Unreliable Narrator, at the moment, is not just, as it was of old, one form of storytelling among many, but one of the foremost avenues of all Warcraft lore. The relegation of the Chronicle series from a lore bible to an unreliable Titan-affiliated point of view, as discussed at length in episode 2 of the series, is, I think, the most extreme and narratively harmful example of this. But unfortunately, it is not alone. Now, many viewers may not be familiar with them, but scattered throughout the Eastern Kingdoms and Kalimdor are lorebooks, which are an in-game representation of the old-school history of Warcraft on the old WoW website. They were, back in the day, a way of making the background lore of Warcraft accessible in-game. But patch 10.0.7, that is to say the Exile's Reach patch, has rendered these two as being the get of Unreliable Narrators, as an annotated copy of one in the Zeskera Vaults attests. As Dr. Doofenshmirtz might say, if I had a nickel for every time a Warcraft lore series was retconned into being by unreliable narrators, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. And before anyone argues that those were always just meant as in-world documents and not as a venue for accessing accurate lore, in the past, Blizzard has even updated them when their information became just partially incorrect. They weren't as flashy as the Chronicle later was, or as complete as fan wikis, but they were still valid. I also believe that it is worth dwelling some more on those, in my opinion, remarkable statements in that 2023 interview. The fact that declaring something once reliable as being actually from an unreliable narrator is, at the moment, a go-to solution for when contradictions or even just inconsistencies arise in narrative development. Not a one-off or one tool among many, but a preeminent, preferred method of narrative development is, I think, almost a baffling growth in its scale. And as these and some upcoming examples attest, they're not kidding when they say that. For illustrative contrast, it used to be that the narrative team's solution to such inconsistencies was simply to clear up the inconsistency and provide a clear-cut canon answer. To use the example of the aforementioned history of Warcraft on the old website, there, Blizzard explicitly stated that some of the older stuff may be out of date, and that they intend to, in the fullness of time, correct it. More recently, the Ask CDev series, where people could submit questions and have them answered by members of Blizzard's creative development team, served a similar purpose. Clear-cut answers to lore ponderings, sometimes specifically to clear up seeming contradictions and inconsistencies, such as why Zul'jin, being a troll with regenerative abilities, didn't grow back his lost arm. Or how come the Bronzebeard family got the throne in the aftermath of the War of the Three Hammers, despite the previous ruling dynasty still being around, and so on. Most recently, this kind of clarification and tidying up of lore was a stated goal of the Chronicle series. Again, for more information, see episode 2. All that is to say that the narrative team's methodology has demonstrably shifted from solving contradictions by keeping a tidy canon to solving contradictions to a large degree by invoking unreliable narrator. Now one might ask, quite reasonably, what the practical difference here is. In the past, Blizzard used to declare some things overruled, so to say, and nowadays they do the same overruling by declaring stuff unreliable. What is the practical difference? As I see it, the practical difference is that the former method was much less disruptive. For example, Blizzard could leave the overall plot and events of the novel Rise of the Horde by Christie Golden intact, while moving the homeland of the Frostwolves from Nagrand to Frostfire Ridge. In contrast, declaring a previously valid source the work of an unreliable narrator not only renders that source almost null, because every sentence of it is now in question, but also strengthens the precedent that established law can, whenever the perceived need arises, be rendered, essentially, false. This is a topic already discussed in episode 1, but in brief, I think the effects of this on the canon, and subsequently the story and lore of Warcraft, are, in my opinion, without exaggeration, ruinous. So, all this is what I mean with the newfound scale of unreliable narrator. As I argued at the beginning of this episode, it has always existed in Warcraft, and I think always should, but not at this scale. Then there is the newfound use of unreliable narrator that I referred to. In brief, whereas in the past it was used, as I argued at the beginning of this episode, to express character and to introduce the occasional bit of thematically appropriate crypticity, it is now used to obfuscate lore and to create new lore by retconning the old. Now, the topic of retconning old lore by declaring it unreliable is already discussed in section 5 of episode 1, but it ties in here too. The treatment of the Chronicle series is, as stated, the most egregious example of this, but again, it is not alone. For example, one of the books found in the Uldaman Legacy of Tyr dungeon states that the overthrow and imprisoning of Azeroth's old gods being the monumental feat of heroes and giants was just lies and propaganda. And in truth, it was just a blow struck by one callous empire against another. The official description of the recent novel War of the Scaleborn by Corny Alameda affirms that the hitherto known history of the origin of the dragonflights was, it turns out, a half-truth at best and lying by omission at worst. A, quote, tale the dragonflights have always told, but not the whole story. Keeper Tyr's selfless sacrifice to protect innocent refugees, arguably a thematic and narrative culmination of his previously established ideology of self-sacrifice, and a founding pillar of human culture in the Warcraft universe, too, it turns out, was a lie all along. In actuality, he sacrificed himself to further the agenda of the Titan Forged. What all of these, and more, have in common is that they use unreliable narrator as a way of, as said, obfuscating the lore, of making it unknowable by virtue of the fact that almost no source can be trusted, no matter how established. A particularly flagrant, so to say, example of this principle is found in the recent sourcebook World of Warcraft, The Dragonflight Codex. On one of the book's first pages, there is an in-character disclaimer warning the reader that the information within cannot be counted upon, and is subject to even being completely changed. Now, I want to emphasize strongly that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone involved in the creation of the book, nor to anyone who likes it. And indeed, from what I know of it, aside from that disclaimer, it is a perfectly worthy addition to Warcraft bibliography. But the fact that a source book, a book intended to illustrate and tell lore, from almost its first page, states that its information is not only uncertain, but also subject to being completely changed, is, in my opinion, frankly preposterous. To put it dramatically, but not, in my opinion, unjustifiably, if lore books should be approached with reservation and skepticism, then what hope does any other source of lore have? To offer a contrast to how Unreliable Narrator used to be used, one example that I particularly like, personally, dates from classic World of Warcraft. In a questline in Ashenvale Forest, you, with the help of your Night Elf and Dryad friends, reconstruct the Rod of Dartol, which allows one to transform into a Firbolg. This eventually leads you to meet the Firbolg Krolg, who laments the recent hardships of his kind and curses the Night Elves, saying, among his other dialogue, "The Night Elves are as old as time, but their arrogance destroys their very world." Now, we, the players, know, and knew even back in 2004, when WoW and this questline launched, that the Night Elves aren't as old as time, literally or even figuratively. Even on Azeroth, there were and are older civilizations than them. But for a Firbolg like Krolg, who probably does not have quick access to a rich historical library somewhere, and whose people enjoy much less power and influence than their Kaldori neighbors, everything he says makes perfect sense. To him, it makes all the sense to think of Night Elven civilization as being as old as time, and powerful, and how their arrogance has commensurately cataclysmic consequences. Clearly he knows of the Sundering. The reason I like the example of Krolg so much, and the reason I am using it as an example here, is because in my opinion, this represents Unreliable Narrator in Warcraft done very right. Krolg is an unreliable narrator. He's angry over what his people have suffered and resentful toward the Night Elves, and his historical information clearly has some flaws in it. But his unreliable narration serves to further his characterization, and to give a fresh perspective on a familiar topic. Night Elves, specifically from the point of view of a resentful, older Firbolg in exile. It does not obscure lore, or make the truth of Night Elven history and character more inaccessible. And all this is what I mean when I speak of the modern use of Unreliable Narrator as being negative for the Warcraft universe. As said, it used to be that Unreliable Narrator was used to express character and atmosphere and opaquely talk about the mysterious. In a word, I think it is fair to say, it used to be employed to increase what is known of the Warcraft universe, even if indirectly. But at present, as I think is also fair to say, it is used to diminish what is known of the Warcraft universe. As said, Unreliable Narrator has always existed in Warcraft, and I think always should, but not with this scale and use. Now, before we wrap up this episode, there was one more aspect I wanted to discuss about all this. Specifically, my assertion that this current employment of Unreliable Narrator is particularly undesirable for the Warcraft universe specifically. Which is something I should mention too. If this was the modus operandi of some other fantasy universe, I might not complain so much. The Elder Scrolls, for example, has a long history of specifically relating almost all of their lore via unreliable narrators. You wouldn't catch me making a video like this for Tess. Besides the fact that Altmer are superior in absolutely every conceivable way to Dunmer. But that's for another video. The reason I think this modern approach is particularly undesirable for the Warcraft universe is because the Warcraft universe is, fundamentally, a heroic, moral one. And I think that this is incompatible with the uncertainty that the current scale and use of unreliable narrator inherently introduces. And I ain't the type of person who says fundamentally just to make it sound more impressive. This is a topic also discussed at length in episode 4, but in brief, by heroic, I mean that the Warcraft universe is full of immense peril and even evil, but that this is challenged and can be overcome by valor, honor, people standing up for what they think is right, even against insurmountable odds. But that heroism is made possible by the context provided by the story and lore. Indeed, the importance of context, is also discussed in section 5 of episode 1. If you want the full treatment, I recommend watching that. So I shan't repeat that whole discussion here, but this is an area where I think the importance of context is particularly vivid. After all, context is what makes the heroics of Warcraft heroic. With a different context, the story of the Shadowlands would be not a desperate campaign against a menace that threatens the whole cosmos, but a hit job against the nobles of Val by the sinister cabal of the Eternal Ones. With a different context, the fall of Gnomragan would not be a horrific tragedy born from betrayal, but rather a comedy of errors that resulted in the gnomes accidentally irradiating their own homeland. With a different context, the sinking of the Temple of Atal Hakar would not be a preemptive strike against a bloodthirsty wild god and his adherents, but rather an act of religious persecution by the Green Dragonflight against the Atalai. With a different context, the Pandaren Revolution would not be a tale of hope, courage, and the fragility of tyranny, but rather just a series of terrorist attacks conducted by extremists that brought down the lawful government. And so on. You get the point. Now, I am not arguing that there can never be any moral ambiguity in Warcraft, nor that every conflict must be heroic and have a clear-cut right and wrong side. Indeed, over the course of this series, I say several times to the contrary. But I am arguing that such are a fundamental key characteristic of the Warcraft universe, and that they cannot coexist with unreliable narrator in its current scale and use, because it renders vast swathes of lore both unknowable and subject to change. But when the context for a given situation is unknowable and or subject to change, as in episode 1, I would say that is no context. And without context, there is no heroism. And without heroism, and this I say with certainty, there is no Warcraft. So what would I change? As one can probably guess after watching the video thus far, I would rein in unreliable and fallible narrator to as it existed before. As I have argued, I think that it is a perfectly suitable and valuable part of Warcraft, but I think it has to be used to express character and atmosphere, for example, rather than obscure lore. Now, I don't think obscuring lore has exactly been the narrative team's foremost purpose, but I do think that has been the result. and at the barest least, I would do away with the current stated practice of using it as a go-to solution for when contradictions and inconsistencies arise. Now, I suspect that a reason the narrative team adopted it to begin with was perhaps the idea that this was a more elegant way of going about it, rather than just issuing a correction or declaring some detail in a source as straight up non-canon. But if this was a factor, as I argued earlier in the video, I don't think it holds. Declaring an entire source as from an unreliable narrator, I think it is in fact much, much messier from a narrative development point of view because of how much collateral damage, so to say, it does. And that is it for this episode. I gotta say, I'm not a fan of unreliable narrator in general, but ironically, making this video helped me appreciate how much I have hitherto liked it in Warcraft. And once again, I have every confidence that we can return to that, and that the narrative team can make as good use of it, and enrich Warcraft by doing so, as hitherto has been. Episode 4. Now, those watching these videos in at least somewhat numerical order will have heard by now me making cryptic references to something big coming up in episode 4. Now, I still want to avoid any and all exaggeration. I'm not just trying to build hype here, so I should make clear that your personal appraisal, gentle viewer, of how significant the topic is may vary. But for me, personally, it is, without competition, the single most important of these topics. Which says a lot, given how intense some of my appraisals during these videos have been. And like I've said and pleaded, if one only watches one episode of this series, I ask that it be that one. I very much hope to see you there. Thank you so much for watching and listening. May your blades never dull.